It was January 1944, and what unfolded at Norfolk Station was a scene no one could have imagined just a few years earlier. As the train screeched to a halt, the doors slid open, not to American soldiers returning home, but to hundreds of German prisoners of war stepping onto U.S. soil for the first time. Their faces carried a mix of shock and disbelief. These were men of the feared Wehrmacht, told they were fighting for an invincible empire. Yet here they stood, far from the battlefields of Europe, disarmed and defeated. And the biggest surprise wasn't their capture. It was the journey that had brought them here. Instead of the freezing, overcrowded cattle cars they knew back home, they had been transported across America in plush Pullman coaches. For the soldiers who once believed in Hitler's promises, this moment was more than disorienting. It was shattering. They had come face to face with a truth their leaders had hidden. The enemy was not broken, not weak, but powerful, organized, and living in a kind of abundance they could hardly comprehend. This passage across the continent was set to shatter every certainty these soldiers held about the global conflict. For months, the tireless machinery of Nazi propaganda had promised them a specific vision of the United States, a nation reduced to rubble, its cities flattened by bombs, its people starving, and its industry crippled beyond repair. They had been assured they would find a broken country. Instead, they were about to discover the most powerful industrial engine the world had ever conceived. The great question that hangs over this period of history is profound. How did over 425,000 German prisoners of war, captured far from home in the deserts of North Africa and the battlefields of Europe, come to personally witness the colossal reality of American industrial might? And how did this revelation ultimately transform not only their perception of the war, but the destiny of democracy itself? By 1943, the tide of war had shifted. In the scorching deserts of North Africa, General Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps met its downfall. Over 130,000 German soldiers surrendered, swelling what would become the largest population of enemy prisoners ever held on American soil. These were not inexperienced recruits, but hardened Panzer veterans, men who had once swept through France and terrorized the British across the desert sands. Yet, even in defeat, they carried with them an unshakable belief in Germany's inevitable victory. Goebbels' propaganda had convinced them that America was soft, decadent, racially divided, and utterly incapable of sustaining real war. To many, the United States was little more than a land of Hollywood glamour and jazz, frivolous, unserious, and weak. The thought that such a society could outproduce the Reich was laughable. The cracks in that illusion appeared almost immediately. On the Liberty ships that ferried them across the Atlantic, products of America's ability to mass-produce 5,000 cargo vessels in just 4 years, German prisoners were already face-to-face with the industrial miracle their U-boats were failing to destroy. But it was the train ride inland that delivered the real shock. In Germany, soldiers had been crammed into freezing boxcars. Now, even as prisoners, they were treated better than they ever had at home. Many of the men, raised on years of anti-American propaganda, shed their hostility in that instant. The revelations only deepened as they traveled across the heartland. Out the windows stretched vast, untouched cities, sprawling factories alive with production, and fertile farmland overflowing with food. The contrast to bombed-out, ration-starved Germany was staggering. The myth of a weak America had crumbled. What they discovered instead was a nation whose abundance and power were undeniable. The Industrial Revolution, which had appeared to many of them as a failing Western construct, arrived in successive waves of revelation. As a component of the Allied war effort, tens of thousands of German prisoners were assigned to work in factories and farms across the country. What unfolded on the assembly lines shattered their comprehension of industrial potential. They toiled side by side with American civilians in facilities that operated with an organizational genius and efficiency that absolutely dwarfed anything found in Germany. They witnessed production lines churning out aircraft, vehicles, and weaponry at speeds and scales that simply seemed impossible. Crucially, they realized this unbelievable production was achieved not despite the war, but because of American logistical mastery and industrial power. Initially, many of the captives, particularly the real cocky bunch from Rommel's elite Africa Corps, captured in 1943, refused to believe what their guards told them about the current progress of the war. David Rathbun, who worked with them on his South Dakota family farm, remembered their initial arrogance. Some prisoners insisted that New York City had indeed been leveled, dismissing all contradictory reports as mere American propaganda. But living and working within America offered a tangible, undeniable truth that eventually overwhelmed the ideological certainty of their propaganda. They were not consuming fabricated stories. They were inhabiting the reality of American industrial supremacy. Beyond the sheer physical scale of production, the prisoners received an unexpected daily education in the workings of a democratic society. This transformation of German soldiers, from believers in totalitarian ideology to witnesses of democratic efficiency, inadvertently provided a framework for solving the profound post-war problem. How could Germany be rebuilt as a democracy? The solution lay not in treaties or military occupation, but in the collective, lived experience of 425,000 men who had seen American capitalism and democracy in action. The American prisoner of war program, guided both by the requirements of the Geneva Convention and a subtle strategic understanding of reciprocity, became a massive, unintended democracy-building initiative. These prisoners attended classes held at American universities, eventually studying through the administration of 103 different institutions. They published their own camp newspapers, organized theatrical productions, and engaged in vibrant debate societies. Most importantly, they were immersed in the daily functions of a democratic society. The education extended far beyond formal classroom learning. German officers, long accustomed to rigid, inviolable hierarchies, were forced by the Geneva Convention requirements to salute American officers as equals. They observed American guards treating them with dignity and respect. They even saw guards from minority backgrounds, people whom Nazi ideology had taught them to despise, acting with fairness and authority. For many German prisoners, factory work in America became an education in more than machinery. They saw an industrial system tied directly to democratic principles, something unimaginable under the Nazi regime. On the factory floor, workers not only produced at staggering levels, but also retained rights the Germans had never witnessed: the freedom to organize, to strike, to voice dissent. What shocked them most was that this freedom didn't weaken production, it strengthened it. Output soared beyond anything the Reich had achieved through fear and coercion. The prisoners began to grasp a deeper truth. America's prosperity was not built on conquest or racial superiority, but on the balance of individual liberty and shared responsibility. However, the story of the German prisoners in America also brought into sharp relief some uncomfortable and glaring contradictions within the American system itself. While the treatment of prisoners was generally exemplary and adhered to the Geneva Convention standards, the experience exposed the fundamental flaws in American society. German prisoners frequently noted the stinging irony that they, as enemy combatants, were permitted to use public facilities and eat in restaurants where African American citizens were explicitly forbidden. Some hardcore Nazi prisoners cynically exploited this hypocrisy, using the denial of rights to Black Americans to mock the nation's claims about fighting for democracy and freedom. The sight of German prisoners enjoying privileges denied to American citizens based on race starkly exposed the emptiness of the nation's democratic rhetoric for its own people. The prisoner camps were also sites of internal conflict, revealing the complex nuances of Nazi support among the captured soldiers. While many prisoners were simply young men caught up in a war they increasingly understood to be lost, hardcore Nazi believers maintained a fierce grip on control in many camps, especially among Africa Corps veterans captured early, when German victory still seemed plausible. These zealots terrorized their fellow captives. They conducted kangaroo courts and brutally murdered prisoners suspected of collaboration or harboring democratic sympathies, a horrific process they chillingly referred to as the Holy Ghost. At least 3 prisoners were formally murdered by their comrades, leading eventually to the execution of 14 Germans by American authorities, marking the first time enemy prisoners had been executed in U.S. history. American authorities, grappling with the complexity of their charges, attempted to combat the entrenched ideology. The Special Projects Division initiated a secret re-education program designed to deprogram Nazi beliefs, yet many officials doubted the possibility of fundamentally altering deeply ingrained adult political philosophies, and the mixed results of the program underscored the immense difficulty of countering years of nationalism and propaganda. Despite these dark episodes, the broader success of the American prisoner of war program lay in its unintended outcomes. It forged a generation of Germans who had personally experienced the freedom and staggering prosperity that was possible under democratic capitalism. The numbers themselves painted a staggering picture of America's industrial power. By the war's end, the United States had produced more than 5,000 cargo ships at one point, launching 4 massive vessels every single day. For prisoners who had come from a Germany crippled by shortages and bombings, it was almost beyond belief. Aircraft carriers seemed to rise from the docks overnight. A nation that had started the war with just 8 ended it with 124. The skies filled with planes as assembly lines poured out 200,000 combat aircraft, another 100,000 for support, and wave after wave of armored vehicles and trucks, over 2 million in total. Many of these machines rolled out of factories that hadn't even existed a year earlier, buildings that seemed to spring up as quickly as the weapons they produced. It was more than numbers. It was the sight of an untouched land harnessing its resources with a speed and scale the prisoners had never imagined possible. German prisoners did more than just observe this colossal output. They were active participants, working within the factories that created these weapons. They loaded the ships destined for Europe and harvested the food that nourished American soldiers and prisoners alike. Most significantly, they saw that this overwhelming output was achieved not through the desperation of slave labor or brutal coercion, but through the highly organized, collaborative effort of free citizens dedicated to a unified purpose. This profound psychological transformation was beautifully encapsulated in moments of simple, shared humanity. On Christmas Day, 1944, even as the brutal Battle of the Bulge raged in the snowy Ardennes forests, German prisoners gathered around pianos in American camps, singing carols alongside their American guards and local families who had invited them for holiday dinner. This act of simple human decency, repeated thousands of times across the American landscape, achieved something that no amount of military force could replicate: the quiet conversion of enemies into potential allies. When the final German prisoners were repatriated in 1946, they returned to a homeland that was profoundly altered. Cities lay flattened by the relentless Allied bombing, industry was decimated, and millions faced imminent starvation. The contrast with the abundant, organized America they had just departed could not have been more striking. Some individuals eventually did return to the United States, becoming citizens of the nation that had once held them captive. But the true overarching triumph of the prisoner program was far greater than individual conversions. The 425,000 German prisoners who had internalized the reality of American industrial might and democratic freedom became the foundational bedrock upon which a new post-war German democracy was meticulously constructed. Their direct personal experience with American prosperity and generosity helped cultivate public support for the Marshall Plan, the massive aid initiative designed to reconstruct Western Europe. They had arrived as committed enemies, firmly convinced by the insidious voice of propaganda that America was irredeemably weak and internally fractured. They returned as indispensable witnesses to a deeper truth. They understood through years of observation that democratic societies, for all their visible flaws and sometimes contentious contradictions, possessed an industrial and organizational capability that authoritarian regimes could never authentically match. They had seen American workers freely strike for better overalls, yet still produce at levels that defied precedent. They had witnessed the seemingly messy, occasionally inefficient processes of democracy, and realized that this apparent chaos was, in fact, an enormous and renewable source of tremendous strength. These former prisoners became the essential skilled workers, managers, and leaders who were instrumental in transforming West Germany into a powerhouse of the European economy. They carried with them the vital understanding that true, enduring prosperity sprang not from military adventurism or toxic racial superiority, but from the essential synergy between individual freedom and collective organized purpose. The initial luxury Pullman cars that had delivered them to their camps in 1943 and 1944 transported far more than just captured soldiers to American soil. They had, in a subtle yet profound sense, delivered the future leaders, citizens, and skilled workers who would help lay the foundation of a newly democratic Germany. In the final accounting of the Second World War, the greatest weapon in America's vast arsenal was never its immense factories, its powerful ships, or its countless planes. It was instead the simple, devastating power of allowing its enemies to see the truth for themselves. The German prisoners, having mocked America and convinced of its weakness by the rigid certainties of Nazi ideology, discovered something far more potent than any division or squadron. In witnessing the undeniable, seamless marriage of American industrial capacity with democratic freedom, they encountered the irresistible, quiet force of a truly free society operating at total war. The trains that crossed America didn't just carry prisoners, they carried men who were about to see the world in a new light. What began as a journey in defeat became a journey of discovery out of propaganda and into reality, out of lies and into truths too clear to ignore. For many, it was the first time they realized that real strength isn't built on fear or conquest, but on free people working side by side with a common purpose. That lesson still matters today. Tyranny isn't always defeated by the biggest guns or the loudest threats. More often, it's undone by the quiet power of example, by showing what freedom, unity, and determination can build when people choose creation over destruction. And that leaves us with a choice of our own, to live as proof of those same values, to protect them, and to pass them on. Because the story doesn't end with them, it continues with us.